6 Peruvian presidents in 6 years and counting. The left-wing opposition setting the wheels in motion to remove Dina Boluarte on Wednesday. Her camp had already disowned her when she was vice president. The 60-year-old Boluarte was plucked from obscurity just last month when her predecessor was impeached on the third try and jailed for trying to rule by decree. But for all of his issues, and there are plenty, Pedro Castillo's ouster sparking a huge backlash. To the impoverished indigenous people from the rural hinterland, the former schoolteacher and trade unionist symbolized a rare turn in power for one of their own. At least 46 have died in 6 weeks of protest, none of those in the capital. Can that great divide between the coastal elites and the Andean highlands be bridged? How to avoid a return to civil war, some are saying, and stop the tiring turnover of leaders in Lima. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Peru's bitter divide. And joining us from Florence in Italy, Denise Rodriguez Olivari, political science at the European University Institute, just back from Lima, I should say, right?
Yes.
Thanks for being with us. From Madrid, he's a former Lima correspondent, Inti Landaro, special editor for the Reuters news agency. How are you? All right, we'll try to patch in with Inti in a moment. From Edmonton in Western Canada, Jorge Sanchez Perez, assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Alberta. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's good to see you all.
And Camille Boutron, researcher at the French think tank IRSEM, the Institute for Strategic Studies. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, that motion to impeach and remove Dina Boluarte, it's going to need a lot more support to even reach the floor of Peru's unicameral Congress. This, as the president has promised in the last days to bring forward snap elections, enough to win a endorsement from the Organization of American States for now. Vedika Bael has the latest.
After weeks of violent anti-government protests that have left scores of people dead, the Organization of American States gave Peru's president its full support. Via teleconference, President Dina Boluarte told the council she'd made moves to hold early elections to end the country's unrest.
I've asked Congress to approve the early elections as soon as possible, and I sincerely hope that the friendly countries of the region will support them.
Demonstrators have taken to the streets for almost 7 weeks, calling for Boluarte's removal, who they say is responsible for a heavy-handed crackdown by security forces that's taken dozens of lives. Whilst it began in the country's south, protesters have poured into the capital for mass demonstrations to keep up the pressure. As well as for her resignation, they're demanding a rewritten constitution and immediate elections. Just days ago, the Peruvian leader ruled out resigning, but called for a national truce, something that the people say won't happen.
There is no truce. There can be no truce with the murder, nor with Congress acting as dictator.
We're going to stay in the streets until she's removed and Congress is thrown out. We want everyone to leave.
Peru's Congress is due to hold a final vote to ratify bringing forward the elections from 2026 to 2024. This after the violence erupted after former President Pedro Castillo was ousted last December after illegally attempting to dissolve the legislature and judiciary.
Denise Rodriguez Olivari, looking at that report, feels like there's something sort of inevitable about what's happened these past 6 weeks. Is there no way for a compromise to be reached?
Well, hopefully there will be. If there are as many deaths as days of government, and somehow we haven't seen any side of this conflict, because we have to put it in a divide of two sides. Making a commitment or making a compromise to bring this to peace. As we speak, probably there are other citizens' protests taking place in Lima and other regions, and especially in the regions that were hit the hardest by police repression, which I have to unfortunately say it's quite extreme in Peru and some places in Latin America.
The numbers vary on how many people have been killed. Jorge Sanchez Perez, I've seen estimates from 47 to 55 people. And again, none of those in the capital, and that's telling.
Yeah, there seems to be quite the divide between the capital and the rest of the country. And you mentioned something in the introduction where it was mentioned that there seems to be an indigenous rural divide slash mestizo white groups, the elites in Lima. And in Peru, the racial dynamics are quite complex, as they might be everywhere else. But in Peru, there's the myth of the mestizo that prevents many people from talking in terms of indigenous rural communities. Because the claim is that you are mestizo, therefore we're all equal, and there's no claim to an identity that has been discriminated against. So this plays in a larger set of inequalities that were originally justified by racism, and now they get to be brushed aside under the claim that we're all the same and there's no racial divisions. So it's clear outside of Peru that these are indigenous protesters, and most deaths are happening to indigenous population. But a lot of elites in Lima, the educational systems in Lima, still refuse to engage in that kind of conversation.
Refusing that kind of conversation, and what we are seeing, and we'll talk more about who's in those protests, but certainly we could talk about how effective they've been. They've been blockades and strikes, and now there are increasing shortages of basic necessities like food and fuel. Liquefied petroleum gas, which is the most popular fuel for vehicles and homes in Peru, has become increasingly hard to find. You can see on this map where there have been the biggest protests. The southern regions of Arequipa, Tacuna, and Puno is speaking. It's interesting when you look at that divide and how that divide is described, says there Jorge. Your thoughts on this, Camille Boutron?
I really think that if we want to understand what's happening in Peru right now, we have to understand it in a long-term perspective. Because, well, you mentioned 6 presidents in 6 years. But before that, we have a long history of violence with the armed conflict during the 80s and 90s. And
the Civil War ended 20 years ago.
Yeah, of course. It ended, but the wounds are still there. There is no consensual memory about what happened. The memory built during the Fujimori period was a narrative about how armed forces and states were heroes against terrorists. And if you really have a close look on what Boluarte is saying, she's saying quite the same thing. So what people really need to do today is to change this kind of narrative and to change it on the discourses, but also on the practices.
All right. You mentioned the discourse of the president. She was forced to issue an apology, or her office was, after she said these remarks before the international press earlier this week.
Tenemos que proteger la vida y la tranquilidad de los 33 millones de peruanos. Puno no es el Perú.
Dina Boluarte.
Dina Boluarte says Puno is not Peru. Then I wonder what exactly the hundreds of soldiers in the department of Puno in the Araquari are doing with weapons of war and with war trucks.
También con camiones de guerra.
Inti Landaro joins us now from Madrid, from the Reuters news agency. Inti, what was your reaction when you heard President Boluarte saying Puno is not Peru?
Well, I think that indeed Dina Boluarte is at the helm of the country. Her presidency is resulting from a severe political crisis, and that her legitimacy as president of Peru is weak, to say it as in a certain way. But on the other hand, the solution for the political crisis in Peru cannot be just imposed by protesters, by rioters. There must be a process democratically where people probably should go through a new election process to determine who will lead the country. But the crisis right now is, I mean, even though Boluarte's legitimacy is very weak, I think the claim from the protesters to say that they represent a majority of Peruvians is also very weak. And I guess that's what she meant. She meant in those comments that were pretty clumsy.
Pretty clumsy. Denise Rodriguez Olivari, if those protesters got their wish and Boluarte was out tomorrow, you can't organize an election tomorrow. So constitutionally, they wouldn't be happy with whoever was running the country.
Well, that's right, especially because it really is a symptom of a much acute crisis. As today, we have more than 20 political parties or political organizations because, well, we can hardly call all of them parties as political science says a party is. But especially because if the presidency, I mean, the executive power was highly delegitimized, the Congress was even more delegitimized. So people are really fed up with the politicians that are currently in Congress and the fact they are delaying this quite inconvenient, I have to say, because of course there's no election that could be organized within weeks. But it's proven to be the only way out of this crisis in a pacific and orderly manner. But at the same time, the people that are our legislators, they are being put there by these political organizations that have finance of illegal economies, some mafias. So people are starting to realize that we will have more of the same.
Jorge Sanchez Perez, this is exactly the words we heard on discussions on this very set when there was the Odebrecht scandal, and that was years ago. Peru's politics have not been reformed since. You agree with what Denise was saying?
I do. I agree that the fragmentation in the country is such that it's going to be extremely hard to find any political actor that has some kind of legitimacy that in order to claim representation of the people. And now we have this fragmentation of delegitimized, again, I'm going to follow Denise here, and I'm not going to call them parties. This delegitimized group of political entities that seem to be financed by dark interests and dark money, so people don't trust them. So why would the system reform itself when it has been beneficial for this corrupt interest? And people are just fed up, not with, I mean, those who are protesting, and many Peruvians, I would say, seem to be fed up not just with the people in current power, but with the entire system. So even if we have snap elections tomorrow, it is quite likely, I agree, that the people that will take over the position as candidates will be basically the same thing we've had before. The difference, I might say, though, is that at least they would have some kind of carte blanche to try to propose reforms that are needed to prevent this thing from going on in the future. Now, the motivation or incentives for them to do that are highly dubious.
All right, so right now it really does sound like gridlock, and what we've seen is a lot of violence. Last week, busloads of protesters converged on the Capitol, and when students at the America's oldest university housed them, security forces moved into San Marcos's campus with tear gas and arrests. The president, the tear gas and arrests, and there were those fearing what you just heard Camille Boutron talk about, and that is a return to the bad old days.
I want guarantees for their lives, or are they also going to disappear like in the 1980s and 90s?
I heard that left-wing congresswoman there alluding to the years of the Civil War. Could there be a return to Civil War?
No, I don't think so, because the context is really different. In the time of the civil war, Peru was more isolated. As far as I'm concerned, I think that social medias and the information is going really fast, so you have more reactions outside, and I think it can play a role. I'm speaking about the neighboring countries and how far the information is going today. It's really not the same thing that in the 80s. But in the same time, honestly, the image of San Marcos on Saturday are really disturbing. They really remind the worst times in Peru, the students in La Cantuta and all these deaths. So I don't think I don't see it like a civil war, but like a political violence establishing, normalizing itself, and for a long time, it can be possible.
Yeah, and there is the question of what the mindset will be, and if it is a violent one, in what could be a cautionary tale for neighboring Colombia and its own peace process. Human Rights Watch lamenting the lost time in the last 2 decades since that civil war ended, as well as the inflammatory position of the direct heirs of a lot of the past brutality. The Human Rights Watch saying that since Keiko Fujimori, the daughter of the autocratic and now imprisoned former president Alberto Fujimori, lost the 2016 presidential election, her party and others aligned with in Congress have repeatedly sought to undermine whoever holds the presidency. In Tilandaro, there are opposite forces, polarizing forces on both sides.
Certainly, and I don't think a civil war is the likeliest outcome you can expect in Peru. But what I think is rather the emergence of some strongmen, an authoritarian regime, being from the left or the right, but using the chaos that is happening now to assert himself as the de facto ruler in Peru. I would think that is the most likely outcome, even through elections, because as you have probably mentioned, there are no real candidate for the presidency in Peru, potential candidate. So if there were elections, if elections are held at some point, there is no politician that is sufficiently popular to become a stable ruler. So it's going to be some sort of weak president that could use the power of the army or other backing to assert himself and get rid of the checks and balances that are needed in a real democracy.
And Denise Rodriguez Olivari, we won't see what we saw in Chile, a constituent assembly to change the system completely?
Well, I think the public opinion is slowly swinging towards an eventual constituent assembly. Let's say that they're showing some parallel, I would say, opinion towards the conduction of an election that actually asked for this, but the result or the approval of an actual new constitution, I think that's a road uphill. I mean, as the latest poll revealed, it will show a more conservative stance than most Peruvians that are pushing for the new constitution really want to acknowledge. And I think that's another issue that hasn't been addressed fully. The right, the extreme right and the extreme left in Peru are more conservative than one will hope so. So if people are pushing for something more progressive in terms of the economy or societal rights, I think they will see something quite different.
Again, Jorge Sanchez Perez, it shows that divide in Peru.
Yes, we have the divide that was mentioned before. And, given that the title of the program is the debate, I would just like to contest some of the terminology that was used by Camille, because I wouldn't call the internal armed conflict that occurred in Peru between the 80s and the 90s a civil war. It was an internal armed conflict, and some territory was controlled by the forces of Shining Path and the revolutionary movement Tupac Amaru. But let's be clear, they actually never had the support or the full support of indigenous populations, right? That is why the largest number of casualties were indigenous people, Quechua speakers, and they had to go to the Amazon, and Ashaninka populations, indigenous groups from the Amazon, were held as slaves, sex slaves. They tried to make them into child soldiers, etc. So the support of these movements that resorted in terrorist actions to attack the regime makes me doubt that the qualification of civil war could be applied there. It clearly was an internal armed conflict. And that being said, the divides in this point in time actually have the support of indigenous population in a quite unorganized way. But I think that if the government keeps the repression going, the strongman might come out to claim that Inti was mentioning, might come out from the army, for example, and exacerbate the divides and actually get the support from indigenous people that was not there during the 80s and the 90s. So I think that would, if the government keeps on this path of violent repression, the divide might actually unify these various groups under a banner of indigenous identity that might actually lead us to an exacerbation of the conflict.
The president herself is from the south, speaks Quechua. Her native region, though, is where the opposition's been strongest. We can show you a protest by indigenous Uru people on Lake Titicaca, which borders the city of Puno at one end and Bolivia at the other. It's interesting because you have Camille Boutron, Pedro Castillo. He's not from the south; he's from the north. But those who are supporting this protest movement, even though he had these corruption scandals, even though he tried to rule by decree or stage a coup, no matter how, depending on how you phrase it, they see him as one of their own.
Yeah, they do. They do because he's simply the first one to be elected from this sector of the populations. Dina Boluarte, she doesn't count with this support because when he took power, she promised that she would resign if he would be destituted, and she didn't do it. So she somehow lost automatically the support and, the belief of the people. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I think right now in Peru, people on the streets, they really don't have confidence at all in people governing whoever it is. That's why I think the hypothesis of the strongman is quite interesting. I just want to highlight the fact that that's true, that it's better to speak about internal armed conflict because Shining Path or Tupac Amaru were not exactly revolutionary guerrillas we could see in other parts of South America. But something really important to remember is when the Truth Commission gave its report, about the deaths and the violence in the conflict, it showed that more than 70,000 people killed were mostly indigenous people, Quechua speakers, originaries from rural areas. So it's not saying that the people on the street who are fighting are in a political protest like we saw in the 90s, but they are just paying the price they already did before.
And Inti Landaro, they hail from regions, and this will sound familiar to a lot of our viewers from around the world, that are rich. In particular, the areas where there's the copper mines. Peru is the world's second biggest producer after Chile, and yet they're some of the poorest people in the country.
Yes, there is. It is the big irony of the big curse of the commodity boom and the commodity wealth is that mines or oil fields are generally in areas far from the cities where people are poor, and no matter how you develop these riches, how much these companies bring to a government budget, most of the money doesn't reach the poor people in the area. It's very difficult to make that happen, and it creates frustration. About the indigenous side of the debate, I just want to come back there and say that again we're back at a point where, 20 years ago when Alejandro Toledo was elected, he was also from Indian descent. He also was very contested and also used that identification with the indigenous people to reach power, and it resulted after several years that he had basically been involved in many corruption scandals, and something like that has happened with Pedro Castillo, who has also used his roots, his closeness to indigenous people, and was kicked out because of some corruption scandal. It's a question of money, and money pocketed apparently illegally, allegedly, because the process is still ongoing. But it isn't that. What I mean is that politicians use this opposition that exists in Peru, that racism, that contradictions, that partisanship that exists, that fracture that exists in the society for their self-interest.
Well, let's look at how it's being that perception is being felt across the region. At the outset of this show, we mentioned how Dina Boluarte has the backing of the Organization of American States. It's been testy relations with. You're sort of half shaking your head. Why is that? Camille, explain.
Oh, just because we have a contradiction between the back of the OEA, I'm sorry, I just know it in Spanish, on the sale, and the neighboring countries. Mexico, the president of Mexico, a few hours ago, I think, just made a statement condemning the violence in Peru, really strong. Other countries like Colombia, maybe we are not so strong, but we're expressing their preoccupation, their worries on the violence against the protesters. President of Chile has been the first to make a statement. So, you have a paradox, a contradiction. I think it's quite interesting at the geopolitical level. That's why the situation right now, it's really not the same one like 30 years ago, for example.
All right, hold that thought, because I want to get back to it. First, I want to develop that a little bit. Jorge Sanchez Perez, while the protests are happening in Peru, there is change going on, what with the election and inauguration of Lula in Brazil. And this past week has seen this club of left-wing leaders converge on Buenos Aires. There was the presidents of countries like Colombia, Chile, Mexico, as was mentioned there by Camille. And they have denounced the violence inside of Peru. Do you agree with Camille that this outside attention is a moderating factor?
I think it is, because at the end of the day, Peru's biggest trading partners are its neighbors. Well, some of its biggest trading partners are its neighbors. So if you want to go and break relationships with Brazil, with Colombia, with Chile, with Bolivia, then you're going to end up isolated. So I don't think, as far as I know, Boluarte has called the ambassadors, the Peruvian foreign affairs minister has called ambassadors for questioning, like this move where they call them as a sign of protest. But diplomatic relationships are ongoing and things keep marching because Peru cannot be isolated. But at the same time, we have the OAS, Organization of American States, OEA in Spanish, Organización de Estados Americanos, OAS, showing support for Boluarte's regime. And a group of senators from the United States have also shown support for Boluarte. So there seems to be a geopolitical gamble here at place too. We are far away from the Cold War, but at least there seems to be some reminiscence to this kind of feeling of dividedness between who supports who and whose deaths or whose killings are more justified than the other. right? So I definitely see the foreign perception, the foreign opinions playing a role in the circumstances in Peru as we speak.
Denise Rodriguez Olivari, is it back to the left-right dynamics of the Cold War?
Well, I think to an extent it can be explained this high degree of polarization in Peruvian politics and in Peruvian society is resembling somehow what the path that Brazil is taking or the US is taking, whereas you are pro or against Boluarte. In this case, a lot of the groups fall into this a bit problematic, I have to say, dichotomy between left and right. But most importantly, we see how leaders from either of those groups are dealing with this, what kind of declarations they have, their public statements. People are quite aware of how sensitive or insensitive their statements are. For example, the phrase "the Peru is not Puno," referring to the southern region, has been received with a lot of discontent and criticism, because of course people are aware that one single region is not the whole country, but it's usually the same regions are being forgotten by Peruvian economy and Peruvian history, and it keeps on reproducing to this day. And I think that's quite a problem. And another fact is that a lot of the international community is paying attention to what's happening in Peru. On the one hand, because of the human rights violation, not only that, but they say there are unlawful detentions, but also because what it could mean to other countries. Is this a cautionary tale of the leftist government going wrong? Is it more of the same? What was going to happen? Are we going to follow Chile's or Brazilian path? I have to say that also the business international community is following what's going on because, of course, of the degree of importance of Peruvian economics and how it's dependent on the exports and how it remained one of the American rising stars in economics, regardless of what's happened in COVID, for example. So I've seen, unfortunately, I think we will talk about this in a near future again because the situation doesn't seem to be getting better.
Yeah, it's a land of contradictions, Inti Landaro. Inflation is high right now. Coming out of COVID, the pandemic was hard on people. Inequality grew, but at the same time, the budget is under control. It seems like the politics are broken, but the economy is still working.
But that's the paradox, the Peruvian paradox for the past 20 years. Peru had an extraordinary instability, a political instability. All the living former presidents are in jail. No government has had a real control over the parliament, or the country has been a succession of political crises, scandals, but the economy has performed well. Companies have developed. You were talking about mines. Several mines were developed. That's a lot of creates some pollution, of course, but at the same time, it brings on a lot of hard currency to a country. You had an agriculture boom. Peru is exporting from avocados to strawberries to blueberries. There is a and the growth, the economic growth, the poverty level has fallen over the past 20 years. So far, it is the economy is resisting somehow, but I think these protests will have a cost for the country's economy. I'm thinking about tourism, for instance. Peru has become a touristic country over the past 20 years, and it's, I guess, many people are canceling the plans to go to Peru. I mean, the Lake Titicaca is a place people want to visit, and right now you have one chance to run into protests, riots, tear gas, canisters spread all over. It's impossible to get to Machu Picchu. So yes, a lot of the economy in Peru is suffering, I think. But still, the exchange rate is holding, and yes, inflation is much slower than in other countries, much quieter, like Argentina or.
Jorge Sanchez Perez, your thoughts on this disconnect?
Well, first of all, I would say that to disconnect what's happening in Peru, when we have an economy that works well and a political system that doesn't work well, shows you that something is off, clearly. Now, we have to say, yes, Peru's levels of extreme poverty have been reduced in the last 20 years. But we just took people from extreme poverty to poverty. So now it won't take you 10 generations for your son or daughter to take a position at a private university. It will just take you 8 generations. So let's not be naive. Yes, inequality and poverty have been reduced, but the degree of inequality and the degree of poverty that has been reduced is not enough to guarantee social peace, right? And if we're going to talk about that, we have to talk about the decentralization process of Peru, which was meant to fail from the beginning. Alejandro Toledo started it after Fujimori because it was a centralized state. And then Alan Garcia took over the reins of the process of decentralization with the goal of making it fail. Why? Because the resources were supposed to be going to the communities from where the mining operations were coming from. And that money was never meant to be used in the regions because the central government never gave them the technological, technocratic, intellectual, governmental resources to make that productive. So the goal was for that money to not be used in the regions and then go back to the central state to be redistributed among corrupt officials. So yes, there's poverty in those regions, and this is something that we have to remember. It was reduced, but not enough to give us peace. And a further note to that, sorry for going on this, is that more than 10 people have died because of the roadblocks, because people couldn't make it to hospitals. Why? Because they have to leave their communities to go to a hospital, because the state was never present. We don't have hospitals in most of Peru, which is a good way of explaining why the most sustainable economy in Latin America in the last 20 years lost 250,000 people due to COVID. There was not enough oxygen plants in the country to save those people.
COVID has certainly exposed the glaring failings of the welfare state in Peru, Camille.
I don't think there's a welfare state in Peru, you know. That's quite simple for me. Peru, as many other Latin American countries, has been the laboratory of neoliberal politics in the 19th. Fujimori and the Fuji shock at these times is a good illustration. Peru is not the only country. Right now it's coming to Europe and other countries. And we know now that this economic model doesn't work. Maybe there is less poverty, but there is social inequalities, enormous. And, you know, to be poor is to earn less than $2 a day, I think. So if you earn $2.20, you are not poor anymore. So it's ridiculous. There is disconnection, economic polarity division, cultural division. Racism in Peru literally kills these people. If not because they are protesting, just because they are with no services, with no hospital, with no access to the education. They are the same women who were forced to be sterilized during the 19th. It's the same region. So, you know, we face a continuity of violence against indigenous, poor, desechable people, desechable meaning disposable, you know. So that's a real problem. And that's why it's important what's happening right now, because I think people on the street are conscious of that. And it makes really part of their claims. They're not just saying we want redistribution of goods and we want to be represented. They really want to exist right now in their nation. And I don't know, we have to see how it's going. But I think there is something like that in what they're saying and what they're doing. And just to finish, it's not just people from region and, marginalized Andean countries and communities. You have also people for the middle class, students, intellectuals. They are also participating somehow in this protest, like they did in 2020, when Vizcarra was removed. There were big demonstrations at this time. So I want to be optimistic and see something happening also here.
Inti Landaro, are you an optimist when it comes to there being some kind of an outcome that doesn't involve one side railroading the other?
Optimistic is a strong word. I certainly hope that there's a peaceful solution, because even though Peru hasn't become Switzerland in the past 20 or 25 years, the situation of the people, the prosperity has improved, and many people are unhappy of the current situation economically, or what we are saying in the highlands or in poor areas. But even there and even everywhere, we're not talking about, the protesters are not representing a huge majority of people. In some areas, there is a majority of people who are ready to protest, but in many places in Peru, a majority of people, even poor people, are against these protests, and that's why the situation is so gridlocked right now.
Denise Rodriguez Olivari, where to turn for reconciliation? Whose job is it to break this gridlock?
Well, I would have to say that the government needs to make the first move, as they have the monopoly of force and power. They have to promote a space, a multi-sectoral, broad space where different actors from the society and the economy can participate, because otherwise I only see this escalating towards a quite extreme turn of events.
Jorge Sanchez Perez, if the government makes the first move, brings forward those elections, can they be staged anytime soon?
Well, there has been a couple of proposals, and one actually entered Congress yesterday to move forward elections before the end of the 2023. So it seems to be possible, and I think that at this stage, if we are to have some kind of social peace that would allow us to, have cooler heads leading the conversation, then that would be a possible solution. I think it is possible, and not only possible, I think it's necessary. And like Denise said, the government has to take the first step, and that the government includes Congress. Now, as long as Congress might feel entitled by the support of the police and the army to their decisions, they might not have enough incentives to actually carry out a conversation that could lead to peace. And that is where I share Inti's lack of optimism, to be fair.
Well, we'll leave it there for now. I want to thank you so much for joining us, Jorge, from Edmonton. I want to thank Inti Landaro in Madrid, Denise Rodriguez Olivari in Florence, Camille Boutron. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.